I certainly have experienced institutional corrections for the last over 40 years now.
So you began, where did you begin in Petersburg, and that was the first duty station?
Yeah, I started there as a correctional officer after doing my internship in 1975.
Wow. And from there you started moving around and ended up, I know you were, I believe you ended up being a case manager as well.
Yeah, I was case manager at, at Petersburg after they gave me the job as a correctional officer. And everybody got a job if you essentially completed the co-op and they wanted, and you passed the interview. Then I became a case manager sometime later at Petersburg. And then about 3 years after that, I transferred to the central office.
So you've had the esteemed pleasure of doing many, many jobs within the prison system. I guess that's something that a lot of wardens would have, is a lot of jobs within the prison system. Well, at what time did you unfortunately run into Mark Jones?
Fortunately or non-fortunately, I have known Mark for more than 20 years now.
Yeah.
Probably over 20 years now. He's a full-time.
Over 20 years. I've been at ECU 29. So this is year 30.
Wait.
Full-time professor at East Carolina. And I have been on various committees at East Carolina.
Yeah.
The first one was to establish a graduate school of social work, which goes all the way back to 1979. And then I've been on many other committees. I'm currently on the advisory board for the East Carolina Department of Criminal Justice.
Right.
Was there any specific thing when you were growing up or near the time that you started working or volunteering at the prison system that led you to want to pursue that genre?
Well, as I tell everybody, I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a criminal lawyer. And go back to those times that I was coming through school. If you did not have the money, you didn't go. Things have changed a whole lot since then, but I didn't have the money. I had gone into the Marine Corps Reserves with the hope of using their program to become a lawyer. 3 weeks after I joined, they dropped the program, which is pretty much normal for the Marine Corps in many ways. But I stayed in the reserves of the Marine Corps. I got out. I had a very good friend who's long since departed this world and in its heavenly world, by the name of Bob Robertson. And Bob said, well, why don't you consider looking at corrections? And he was a probation officer in Chewan County. And he's the one who got me interested in going back to school in corrections. And I joined the department. I had done 2 years at College of the Albemarle, which is a community college in Elizabeth City. And then I went over to Greenville and I did 2 years there and graduated in 1975. It was a good experience. And like I said, Bob said, okay, since you can't go in the Marine Corps and get a law degree, why don't you work in corrections? He says it has as much to do with law as almost any other profession. Because I, at that point in time, did not want to be a police officer. And I said, okay. And then when I got to East Carolina, I was in Gus Moeller's seminar class. He had taught me several classes on criminal law, and I think correctional law rather than criminal law. And that's when he asked me, would you like to go to Petersburg? The key it was paid. And most internships aren't paid. So since I was paying my way through school, wherever I went to for my internship, I was going to have to get another job. Well, I didn't have to get another job at Petersburg. I was paid and went to work.
Well, that was that. I mean, and the Bureau of Prisons still has that. They have a lot of internships that are paid. So that is a good way to go. So those out there that are thinking about it and trying to figure out which way to go, you have Mr. Beeler. And myself, I can assure you, it's a great way to go if that's your goal to do, and just as career-wise, and have many, many opportunities. So you started there, Petersburg, you went to central office. How long did you stay up in central office?
Well, I went to central office twice.
Tell us about central office.
I went to central office the first time in 1979. Went into the WITSEC section of the central office and worked as a WITSEC case manager for just about a year, I guess. And then there was an opening as the assistant correctional programs administrator, who wrote policies and looked at the District of Columbia system and did this District of Columbia designations. So I went over to DCDC desk, which was the assistant correctional administrator, stayed there, wrote policies, managed policies that the executive staff said they wanted to change. And then about a year and a half, maybe not even a year later, the assistant director for correctional programs asked me if I wanted to be his executive assistant. That was probably the smartest and hardest selection I ever made. Hardest in the sense that he had 7 major offices, and since I was his exec, I had to learn all the baseline stuff for all 7 of his offices, because the paperwork would come to me and I would have to okay it as a quality control procedure before I sent it to him.
And how long were you in that position?
2 years.
And from there, once you left there, where did you go?
Well, my wife had just had our little girl, who's now 40 years old, a little girl. And my wife had had many difficulties with the birth, and she was post-eclamptic, which means that she had to be monitored very closely. I asked if I could go anywhere on the eastern United States so I could bring her down on her appointments in an 8-hour drive, and they sent me back to Petersburg for a year.
Well, that worked out. Petersburg. Seems like Petersburg became home for you.
Well, that was the second time was the last time I was at Petersburg, but I went back there as a case management coordinator and as the institution hearing officer at that time. That role has changed to the DHO, but back at that time, there was an institutional hearing officer. So I handled 2 jobs for that year and learned a whole lot, because the warden that I had was a financial management type. I knew very little about financial management. And when I walked in, he says, "You will know how to deal with financial management when you leave here. I will not let you leave here until you know financial management." So that was an opportunity to learn financial management. And if you learn financial management, you basically had to learn the basics of human resources. So I took advantage of both those things, and I thought it was it was a very tiring year, but I thought it was a wonderful year.
That working in HR, and that's a tiring business. All that. I mean, I'd rather deal with anything else. I did a little stint with them, and I was like, man, y'all really do some work, and they're actually busy. A lot busier people give them credit for. So that is something else. Hearing officer. And I know Keone will love to hear this, because the hearing officer, Keone, gets all the deals with the management of the prison. When somebody breaks the rules, and we have a write-up, eventually it comes to him and he makes certain decisions. Any stories that you can remember that just stand out in your mind as being his hearing officer and being in that position, which is now the DHO, is everybody, but institutional, that's changed.
Yeah, nobody would even think about some of these stories, but I had an individual who got mad at me, which probably wasn't all that unusual because I was meting out justice. But he got mad at me. He threw the table across at me. And I probably won't forget that. He was very angry. I can't even remember what he did, but I put him into administrative segregation for 15 days. And he says, "How dare you?" Picked up the table and threw at me. The real issue is that he just got another incident report for throwing the table at me. And if he had thought for about 2 seconds, he had done 12 days. I remember this one. I said, "Why did you do that? You already had 12 days served. So you only had to serve 3 more before you got popped out." He said, "I was just mad at you." And I said, "Okay, that's fine. As long as you're not mad at me when you get out in 30 more days."
Jeez. And he's not, I guarantee you're not talking about one of these little folding tables that you get from Walmart.
The wooden table that they had actually made at Warden. And then when Warden got ready to close down, we went and got a bunch of their furniture.
Oh, wow. It's just not small. And let me mention this. Mr. Beeler is not a small guy, okay? Don't, he said there he's not a small, you are, as I remember, you are 6 feet plus.
Well, right now I've lost an inch or so, but I'm 6'3" and weigh right at 250.
Yeah, so he's never been a small guy just to say, "I'm going to pick up a table and throw it at him." He was pretty upset. He's not a small guy. But yeah, hearing those, and I did plenty of those as well, just sitting when I worked in the unit, and we get to dish out discipline, like we will say, but you have all kinds of people get mad at you for different kind of reason, and be like, "Well, you're the one that created this whole situation. Why are you mad at me for? You just gotta, now you have to pay your dues and move on, and we'll just work from here."
Mark,
You were Keone, yeah, go ahead.
no, go ahead. Go ahead. You asked because you're still on the timeline. Go ahead.
Okay. And I like to use the word mentorship. You mentored a lot of people, staff, and also inmates. Anybody that you have that comes to mind under your mentorship that just stands out for many reasons?
Yeah. Do you have that guy that, some people are labeled, "Oh, this is a lost cause. He's going to be in here forever." And you kind of mentored that inmate and saw him get out and never returned, and kind of just heard through the grapevine that he's doing very well for himself?
There's stories about that. The farther you go up into the hierarchy of the prison service, the less and less you get to know about individual inmates. But there were several inmates who I would make sure that I talked. Number one is to keep them on the compound, because a lot of them, they just needed the attention to stay on the compound. So I would try to talk to them every day. And most of them stayed in and then got out. Regrettably, a couple of them came back. Very difficult for an individual to leave prison after 20 years and go out to nothing and realize that we're not providing them anything per se, other than a halfway house and some gate money. And all of a sudden they can't master the intricacies of modern day life, and they come back. But as far as mentoring concerned, my philosophy on mentoring is basically twofold. Number one is you want to provide them issues or guidelines or stuff that they could take and use if they wanted to. And I'm talking about inmates now, that could help. I told every inmate in the institution, and Pedro heard me say this more times than not, it's a crying shame that you came in here without an education, but it would be a more crying shame if you left here without a GED. Many folks go into the system without baseline education. And we all know that one of the drivers to keep people out of prison is having a good education. I'm thrilled that the Pell Grants are coming back, where those people who apply themselves may well find themselves being a post-secondary education courses. They're able to take vocational courses. And that's usually where my mentorship went, is trying to talk them into getting into an education program. Occasionally I would also look at them and say, why don't you go to a substance abuse programming? And that's a very difficult thing, but many of them had the did not have the coping strategies to deal with that by going to substance abuse training. Those coping mechanisms developed. And so those are the two prime areas I worked with individual inmates with. For staff, the whole issue is the whole gamut. I used to take what was called retreads all the time. And those are people who had been working, got in trouble, got demoted or disciplined, and got sent someplace else. I thought it was a horrible waste of time, and that they, for somewhat of an innocuous reason, got demoted and then got put in the penalty box. Well, I would try to get them out of the penalty box. And I did that several times for staff, because they would have to tell me that they made a mistake. They would have to tell me they understood the mistake. They would have to tell me that they were ready to get back onto sometimes the supervision train. And I would bring a lot of those people back.
Hey, Pedro, if I may, let me ask Art a couple of things, if you don't mind.
No, go ahead, Mark.
No, that's why you're here.
First off, and I worked in the Georgia prison system for 1 year, so I'm sort of an insider or outsider with this. I mean, I don't have nearly the experience that Art and Pedro had in the prison system, but I have a little bit. But I can speak a bit detached here in a way, and I can tell the audience out there that it's, first off, like as it's been said already, the popular media conceptions of what goes on in prison are wildly inaccurate, and there's also the presentation of wardens or superintendents in prison is even more inaccurate.
Yeah.
The two movies that come to my mind are Cool Hand Luke and Shawshank Redemption, where the wardens were brutal, they were corrupt, they were dishonest, and so forth. So that misconception is out there. They don't make in most prison movies, the inmates are the good guys, and the people that work there are the bad guys. And also it takes a special kind of person, and I don't mean this quite the wrong way, but I don't know. Art and Pedro have been so close to it for so long that they don't realize that it takes a certain kind of person to be able to work and be effective in a prison. Not everybody could do it. I mean, you go in and you leave at the end of the day, but living in an institutional life where the doors close behind you and so forth, it's not for everyone. It takes a special kind of person to do that. And very few people grow up aspiring to be to work in the prison system. I found my experience more often than not is that they kind of come to it later in life, relatively late, or sometimes just fall into it, as I did. And it looks kind of like Art, did the same thing. But the thing that we got Art here, and just telling the audience, and this is not just flattery or anything like that, but there's no more knowledgeable person in the state of North Carolina when it comes to corrections than Art Beeler. The two things that have impressed me the most about Art, which I'd like him to address at some point, would be one, his work and advocacy for the mentally ill, because Art has not mentioned this yet, but in addition to being a prison superintendent, he was also a hospital administrator, and they dealt with mentally ill inmates. And the other thing has been Art's advocacy for reentering prisoners and the collateral consequences that come with the conviction that he is also hard at work on. So I don't know if Art, you want to go ahead and address some of that stuff now, or I just throw it out there.
I can address some of it, Mark. The issue is prisons become a whole lot of things that they were never designed to be. The biggest one of that is mental illness. Prior to the 1950s, we had state hospitals everywhere. Not that they were very good institutions in a lot of cases. And there were a lot of scrutiny of the state mental health hospitals. A lot of movies said that they were horrible places to be. And they weren't good places to be. But we threw the baby out with the bathwater, quite frankly. What we did is we then said, okay, we're going to put these people in the community under the Community Mental Health Act of 1963, and we're going to let them get transitional care to be able to make their way into the community. Well, this is unfortunate, but the timeline of when the mental health law was passed was October 1963. In November 1963, John Kennedy was assassinated. And the reason that's kind of linked is because his family, including his sister, had mental illness. So he was in favor of trying to do something more than warehousing the folks. Well,
his sister, one of his sisters was a principal founder of Special Olympics. I would remember that.
Shiver, who was not the sister who was mentally ill,
right?
But Eunice Shiver was the founder of the Special Olympics. But what happened is that after he was assassinated, Vietnam was moving fast and furious, and other things were happening. Lyndon Johnson did not have the same bent. Although I will tell you that they had a lot of money the first couple of years, but Lyndon Johnson did not have the same bent toward making sure that mental health policies were changed. And all of a sudden we had a situation where we had the de-incarceration of state hospitals and the population of prisons with the mentally ill. I call it trans-institutionalization is what I call it. Because what happened is oftentimes for very little things, people ended up in prisons or jails, and then they graduated. And over the time they graduated and they became more and more entrenched into the prison system. If anybody ever wants to look at a video that's on Frontline, go out and clip and look at something called the New Asylums or the Asylums. It's done back in the 90s, but it still is a portrayal that goes very well in explaining that prisons are not mental health hospitals, but that we have been forced to become mental health hospitals. So if you think that's it at the state level and the federal level, just think about the poor sheriff out there who is in a rural county in eastern North Carolina, and all of a sudden he gets a schizophrenic individual, and all he knows how to do is give him what kind of pill that the doctor prescribes. There's very little interaction unless the person goes off the deep edge, and then they will transfer him to the state custody. So mental illness impacts everybody inside of institutions. And we could have discussions that would last all day, all night, and all day tomorrow on how we have forgotten that segment of the population. They really don't have any constituency. The only constituency they have are the advocates, people in NAMI or disability rights. They speak for the folks. And quite frankly, they don't always speak the best stuff for the folks because these folks have lots of issues. I still work trying to deal with the incarceration of the mentally ill. I don't think it's going to go away in my lifetime, but quite frankly, it needs to go away, and they need to go back into figuring out how to put these people, very, very small number of people, in mental health hospitals and then run mental health in the community. I think most of them could handle the community. What has happened since then, of course, is that more and more of them go to prison or jails. They get into a little bit of trouble. That little bit of trouble aggravates to a larger period of trouble. and all of a sudden, instead of doing 6 months, they're doing 6 years. And that's the reality. The reason that we can't go back and build state hospitals is money. Pure and simple, and it's not necessarily what you think of when I say money. Most of the folks that are in the community with mental illness, they get Medicaid or they get SSI, which is supplemental security income. And so the federal government is paying their way. 55% of Medicaid funds come from the federal government. So no one in the states wants to take over that role again, because all of a sudden they find out how much it's going to cost them. I know that sounds rather cynical, and it probably is, but it's what my experience has been, that the state groups want you to do better, but they don't want to take over the responsibility. I think that there have been some moves afoot to try and decriminalize the mentally ill, but I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. If anybody had anything that I would recommend for anybody who's interested in reading about mental health, read Peter Irwin's book, Crazy, A Father's Journey Through the Mental Illness. He had a son who was bipolar, and he does a real good job describing not the bureaucracy, but describing how his son gets involved and where his son ends up. So I think, and it hits everybody, okay? We don't have a lot of mental health beds in the state of North Carolina. Most of what we have are for commitments, meaning the judge has sent somebody to the state hospital based upon their need to determine that they are competent or non-competent to save trial or stand trial. And most of the time, sheriff deputies have to sit on those people until there's a bed someplace in the state of North Carolina. That's called an involuntary commitment process. And we see lots of people who sit in voluntary commitment. What that does, though, it does not let treatment beds be out there in the state hospitals hardly at all for those people who need treatment. I don't know if you want me to delve any further into mental health.
No, I think it would be great if in the future we had a follow-up episode or a second episode with you just to talk about that topic, because that's a good topic and a needed topic for all of our viewers and people beyond our viewers to talk about and watch. I think that would be great to just have that as a sole episode. One of the things I wanted to say, because of course I don't know you like Pedro and like Mark, so this isn't flattery. This is just what I've known. That the thing that I work with Pedro. I used to coach Pedro's daughter, and now he's an employee of mine. And before we even did this podcast, I heard your name. One of the things he used to always talk about was your ability to manage and lead people. I know that's a hard job as a warden, because you not only have a prison to worry about, but you've also got guards to worry about. You've got counselors to worry about. So you've got two different types of people that you're having to manage. And he said he had a great appreciation for you because you didn't have the time and patience for people who just showed up to collect the paycheck and go home, even though, you had to take some of those because that's how you fill the ranks. But he really talked about you emphasizing the people, whether it was a guard, whether it was a counselor, having conviction in their job and doing their job thoroughly and properly and treating everybody with respect. So that's what Pedro had talked to me a lot about, how you were effective as a warden, because you were really good with managing the guards and the counselors. And you made sure that people weren't just there just to be there. Does that sound like a true statement from Pedro?
Well, let me just say, you could also add medical staff to that too.
Yeah, all the staff. Yeah,
experience at Butner. Mm-hmm. he was not only a warden, he was a hospital administrator.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Working as a CEO of an institution is primarily like working as a CEO most anywhere. except you have different populations. I think people have to be passionate about what they do for a living, no matter what it is. I think you can be passionate as a ditch digger, digging a ditch, although not many people dig them with shovels anymore. But I think you're passionate there. I think you can be passionate as a shortwave cook, order cook in a restaurant, and the list could go on and on. What I used to tell the offenders when they were there is find something that you like to do and try to work toward learning how to do that. The collateral consequences out there shuts a lot of doors in their faces, but there's some things that they can do and do very well. And I said, find a way to be passionate about it. Because people who are passionate about what they do, they typically do a good job.
Art, excuse me, but explain to the audience what collateral consequences mean.
Sure. Collateral consequences are a civil penalty which follows the person into his post-confinement world and can have real impact. Their collateral consequences are made up by legislatures, are made up by licenses bureaus, that they can say that a felon cannot work in a barbershop. And I'm making that up, okay? I haven't looked that up in recent years. But you have to have a license to be a licensed barber. And for a long period of time, even though I think it may have been changed, you had to get permission to be a barber if you had a previous felony conviction.
But there are all kind of jobs where their doors aren't closed. Certain kinds of jobs are where that's the case.
Yeah, there is. If anybody's really interested, you can go to the University of North Carolina School of Government website, and there is a listing of all those collateral consequences in North Carolina. There's also a National Collateral Consequences Center in Washington, D.C. that the former pardon attorney runs. Her name is Margaret Love. So if you use her name in collateral consequences, you'll get a whole listing of stuff there.
Well, voting's a big one too, right? You had mentioned voting.
Well, yeah, voting is huge. Here in Eastern North Carolina, the one that is the most huge is being able to hunt. And a former felon can't have a weapon, whether it's a long rifle or a pistol. They can't go out and hunt. And quite frankly, some of them make their livelihood through that sort of behavior. The craziest one is where I really got involved in this, Mark, was the chief United States District Court judge out of the Western District of North Carolina was coming to the institution one day, and he had an African-American male with him. And he made a comment that, "Hi, this is Bobby. He has a prior conviction. Can he come into your institution?" And being a warden, you had a whole lot of discretion. And he was going to be with us the whole time. He wasn't going to stray from us. So I said, as long as he stays with you and I, the answer is yes. And on that tour of the institution, I learned that he could not get a small business loan because he had a drug conviction 25 years previously. That was the only conviction on the books. He had long since finished his time. I think he only did 9 months. And he had long since finished his probation or parole at that time. I don't remember which one, but he'd been off paper for 15 years. And being off paper means he didn't have any encumbrances against him because of his criminal conviction. And he still was not able to get a small business loan to open his own barbershop. And that's where the word barber always comes in, because he had that conviction. That's really when I started working and trying to speak for those people who honestly have 2 strikes against them when they walk out the front door. Many of them, some of them should have 2 strikes against them, but more than 60% of them just want to go out and go home and do their work. And in reality, we throw so much in front of them that they have to deal with that it's very hard for them to do that. You know, this misnomer that everybody's a bad guy who goes to prison just isn't true. Have they done something wrong? Yes. Did they get convicted of a crime? Yes. Do they have to do their time? Yes. But other than that, we, in my mind, should be working to keep them out when they go out. And we have, in the early 1990s, through the Get Tough on Crime era, we have set up a system of collateral consequences across the nation that really makes it difficult for anybody to make it into society because the rules are very strict in many cases.
Art, that's that you bring that up, because that's one thing that I always bring up when we do these shows with Pedro. I always say the thing of how many times do I have to say I'm sorry? Now, we know the people who commit crimes, go to prison, go out and immediately commit the same crimes, the career criminals. But you have that sect of people that you're talking about, whether we want to say they do a stupid thing, they make a mistake, or they purposely break the law, especially when they're young, when they're 20. A 20-year-old breaks the law, goes to jail, gets out at 23. Does he have to be punished for the next 40 years because of something he did when he was 20? I know states where you can't get a driver's license. Well, the first thing you need when you get a job is an ID. And there's some states where you can't even get an ID. So it's like you were saying, we're putting up so many roadblocks that the ones who want to turn their life around, it becomes incredibly hard. And then we know what happens when that person gets out and they've got 3 kids, they've got a wife, they can't get a job, they're trying really hard, and you fall back on what got you in trouble in the first place.
Let me jump in there, add another dimension to it, because now, of course, our experience in the prison system, mine was in probation, and you don't have to go to prison to suffer those collateral consequences, because on any given day, 2/3 of our correctional population is not in prison; it's in the community. They're on probation and parole, and a lot of those. But nevertheless, I think back my time back in the 1980s when I was working probation, I had people that were 17. 17 was the age of adulthood in Georgia at that time. But people who were, say, 18 years old, who were convicted of, say, felony shoplifting or selling marijuana, which are both still against the law when they're both felonies. But I think 40 years later, that 19-year-old is still living with that collateral consequence.
Yeah.
At the time, I didn't think much about that. But I look back now, I think 40 years ago, my good gracious, where was I at that age? Would I want to be held accountable at age 62, which I am now, for something I did when I was 18 or 19?
You know, when I teach this at college level, Chief USPO by the name of Greg Forrest and I teach this together much of the time.
Yeah, the guy from Charlotte, right?
Yeah, from Charlotte. And we go in saying, I throw a bell curve up on the wall. And I say, this is a normal distribution curve. And this is how the population, if everything else is equal, will span down. And I say, okay, on the left, you've got an outlier that is more than 2 standard deviations from the mean. I know you didn't want a statistics lesson, Pedro, but just look up. But they're 2 standard deviations from the mean. They're over on the left-hand side. Those people, it doesn't matter if you gave them a steak and a filet mignon every day. They still would be involved in crime. Yeah. And then go other side of the normal curve, and those people want to try to make it really diligently, but they get hit very soon and they go back. But what really is here is the 60% in the middle. The 2 standard deviations from the mean on the right, 2 standard deviations from the mean on the left. And most of those people want to make it. And I sincerely believe that most of them want not to come back to prison. Because I will tell you folks, no matter what you see on TV, the deprivation of prison, the deprivation of liberty is not a nice thing. But that 60% that's in the middle there, plus the 12.5% on the right or the 20% on the right, the 20% is never going to go back because they got support. They got a mommy or a daddy or granddaughter and blah, 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 and they got support. And some of our white collar criminals go into that room. They really don't have anything to worry about except paying their fines and making sure that they show up on time. But that middle ground, that 60% is where it really is. And we haven't figured out how to deal with this because you're exactly right. Johnny goes out and he wants to stay out. He has got 2 or 3 kids, and his mother, who has been taking care of them for the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, says, I really am tired. I can't take care of these children anymore. And that's understandable. So all of a sudden, the kids need braces. Well, he's working at McDonald's for now $18 an hour, but he's working at McDonald's because it's the only job he can find, and he doesn't have any particular skills that make him special. So he's out there working at McDonald's, and his kids need braces. And what happens? He wants to be a good dad. And so he goes out and says, okay, I'll mule this stuff one time, meaning he will transport the stuff one time, he'll get the payoff, and he'll stop. Well, 1 time becomes 2 times, 2 times become 3 times. I am a firm believer, and most of my peers do not believe this. I'm a firm believer is when somebody goes out into the community as a returning citizen, that for the first year, at least, we need to have people with them to help them get through the process. In North Carolina, for example, there is no parole. There's supervision, but the supervision only lasts for a very short time unless you're a sex offender. There is no halfway houses for the most part in North Carolina, and a lot of other things where the individual just gets let out of the gate with gate money, which is most probably less than $100, and says, bye, you have a good time, see you later. Well, I think if we supported these people a little better, and people say, well, why should we support them? They were inmates. And it's really an economic discussion. It costs $28,000 a year to keep somebody on average in North Carolina. I think that's the latest figure I saw. Mark, you might have. That's probably right. But, giving somebody $2,000 a month for a year to help them get their feet on the ground is what, $24,000 at most? And that's not even that much, $2,000 a month. But if we gave them that much money, or we gave them that much money in kind with something else like tools or those kind of things, I don't think we would have nearly as many people coming back as we do now. The other factor that you haven't mentioned that is a huge factor in our rural state is transportation.
Yeah.
These folks who get out and say they go back to my hometown of Edenton, North Carolina, there is no public transportation. And if the guy gets a job out at the mill that works for textiles, which still exists there, was 20 miles from Edenton. Well, he can't go to work there because he can't get there. And we do that to ourselves all the time. So I have a real bent toward, if we want to make these people whole again, we have them do their time. We find out the very minimum that will make them get whole again. And then we work with them for a little while.
And I think also, and you probably follow me on this, that we kind of fail them while they're in the system as well, because we don't prepare them for those questions, for those answers. While I was a lieutenant, that was I had a number of questions I would ask before I signed him out, and I would ask him questions about money, support, and all that, and that gave me an idea. Okay, this guy is really going to make it, or this guy's coming back, because there's things that leads you to know, oh, he's not ready. He wants to get out, but he's not ready because we didn't prepare him. We didn't give him all the tools needed while he was in.
Yeah, there's four things that over and over and over again that an individual who is reentering into society needs to have. One is a job or an education or a mix thereof, going to school and getting a job. One is support from family or friends. It doesn't have to be family, but they got to have support. One is transportation. And I was really shocked somewhat to see that a lot of people fail because they don't have the vehicle to get back and forth to work. And one is a supportive, I said that already, supportive family. You know, these guys have some of them have burnt most of their bridges. So we've got to figure out what to do with those individuals. But you're right, Pedro. You know, we don't do enough private-public partnerships. And that's another one of my huge issues. As you know, that when I was at Butner, I started a private-public partnership with Meineke.
Yes.
That people who came into the institution and indicated they wanted to go into the Meineke program, which was a lucrative program, they could go in and finish it. They got an apprenticeship, and when they got the apprenticeship, when they got out, Meineke guaranteed them employment at a decent wage. But for whatever reason, when I left, that program dropped off.
I don't know why it dropped off either. I know as when I was there, I didn't refer them to it. I made it made you going to go to that class. It's not a question. Well, no, you have time, go there. I used to make that a thing, especially new guys coming in. You are definitely going to be in your GED class. I am going to be checking on you that you are in GED class and you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And I made sure of that. I made sure that some of the, even as a lieutenant, a lot of guys knew I was come and check those classes. And I was sitting there, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. I would do that. I felt like it was a need of me to make sure these guys were doing what they were supposed to do. I had other things to do, but that was also, I just added that to my.
Well, Art said you were passionate. Art, this isn't funny, but he made it funny. Our last guest was a guy named Mike. He was a owned his own multi-million-dollar real estate business without a high school diploma. He did something by accident and ended up in jail. But when he got out of jail, I'm giving you the short version, he got offered a job for a VP position, 6 figures, when he got out of jail, but the government kept blocking it. And so he literally has the transcript. He went to court and the government, the judge asked the government, why are you blocking him from getting this job? And their response was, we don't think he deserves it. That was their legal response to this guy not getting a VP job. And so it's not funny, but that speaks to what you're talking about, is like, get out of the way and let this person return to a life that can be productive for him. So I just wanted to share that story with you. We had a whole interview with him, and that dropped my jaw when I got that story.
You notice it didn't drop my jaw.
Because you've heard it more times than me.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Oh, wow. Well,
is there, and this is the question we always ask everyone, was there ever a time in your career where you wanted to call it quits and said, you know what, this is too much, I can't take it? If you didn't, fine. If you did, what got you over that hump to continue doing the work that you've been doing?
Well, there was only one time that I wanted to quit, and it happened when I was an associate warden at an institution. And I had just been promoted to being a warden at another institution. And the warden at the first institution called me and says, there's dirt on the window ledges over by such and such and such and such. I said, sir, as soon as count's over, because we were in the middle of count. And I said, as soon as count's over, I'll get an inmate detail and we'll get it clean. And his comment to me was, you didn't hear me very well, Mr. Beeler. I want those windows cleaned now. And I said, yes, sir. And I went and got the ladder and got the water and got the soap out of my, out of the mop closet, and I went and cleaned it. And he saw me out there and he said, well, why didn't you get an officer to clean it? And that's something I was going to talk to you about anyway. You got to start calling them officers, not guards. But anyway, I told the warden at the time, I said, sir, I would not ask anybody to do something that I was not willing to do myself. That was unusual, and this is unusual, so I will clean the windowsills. And I went home that night, and I told my wife, I'm going to quit. And I had about 15 or 20, I guess about 15 years in at that time. And she says, oh, no, you don't. You're 3/4 of the way home for retirement. You're not quitting.
At that time, I think we all get it right about that time, that 15 years, and sometimes you just want to call it quits because something like that will happen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think what's interesting about that story, though, and I think it's so illustrative of a lot of professions, to where, you know, the greatest threat to a lot of organizations is managerial ego, and it's not that the person does not like the job; it's that the person is not allowed to do their job because of egotistical management. And that's what Art was talking about here. I mean, simple as that. But a lot of people, if they would realize pretty quick it's not for them if they got into it. They wouldn't have to wait 15 years. But we've all been in similar situations, I suppose.
Yeah, there were many times that I had stuff that happened that I was upset about, but that's the only time in my 35 years that I actually went home and said, I'm going to quit.
But you said to me once when I was interviewing you about something about a class I was teaching, you said that inmates are going to be inmates. That's never really going to change. Unfortunately, that's the way it is. And so I guess in a way we have that kind of, kind of a childlike attitude toward them. But it's all. I think there was a governor for the state of Georgia back in the '60s, Lester Maddox.
Oh yeah.
When he was confronted about the problems in the Georgia prison system, his response was, "Well, what we need is a better class of inmate, a better class of prisoner." It's like if those people would just stop being the way they are, everything would be all right.
Yeah, Mr. Maddox had a way of saying that. He and during that time, he and George Wallace were bosom buddies.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I remember well, Lester Maddox.
Hey, Art, did you ever in your time as warden, do you have a story of someone who spent a large deal of time in your prison and then they were acquitted and found innocent, and they had to get that gate money and go home?
In all honesty, no. I had a lot of people who did time for civil commitment because of their mental illness, who got so they could go home. And that's due to the federal system. Most states have out in the community, and the feds, if they're civilly committed because they're too dangerous to be placed in the community, the judge rules that, and the person stays with us until the judge says that the person is well enough to go home. And so I had a number of those people who got well enough to go home, but I never had anybody. I mean, I had people when I was the warden in Chicago at the jail in Chicago who were able to get out because the judge who controlled the case said, no, I'm not going forward with this case. But that's really at the up at the front end of their term. I didn't have anybody who did a lot of time who ended up saying, you're going to leave. And it became very difficult to do that in the federal system for a couple of reasons. Number one is that they had their right of appeal, but after that right of appeal, which is done within the first little bit of time after they're convicted, they really had no avenue to go back to the court and proffer that unless there was brand new evidence, clean DNA evidence. There really wasn't anything there to help them get a new trial.
Okay.
Tony, I think one thing the audience needs to note in relation to that is that while the federal government, with which Art was affiliated with most of his career, there are some crimes that are federal crimes and prosecuted in federal courts, but the vast majority, the big numbers of inmates, both probation, parole, and people in prison, those are state crimes. And I think that that population you're talking about, Keone, it can happen anywhere, but I think a person is more likely to fall through the cracks in the state systems, which are just overwhelmed with numbers. I mean, just when you have 200 and 300 people going through court in a day, that type of thing, just the mass plea bargaining, that type of stuff. The federal system is a lot slower and has a lot fewer numbers, so I think that's a lot less likely to happen.
And that's very true.
Good points, Mark. I mean, that's why we have the show. You have the everyday people that don't know these things. They only know what they think they know. And they get a lot of false informations and false representations. That's why we have Mr. Beeler on here, retired warden. That's why we've had ex-officers on the show. And that's why we also have ex-cons on the show. We've had a lot of ex-cons on the show that are leading very successful lives. We try not to paint the image that everyone who's been to prison, you can just have this evil thought in your head that they're just lurking in the depths waiting to get you. These are people. Some of them belong in prison. Some of them belong under the jail. But then there's also people who make bad decisions and want to get back to society. We're going to wrap up, Pedro.
And that's that 60% that are out there. They want to go back to society and make it work. I have just one question. We talked about a lot of stuff that's gone wrong in the system. But my one question for you are what are we doing right? I mean, we talk about the things that we're doing wrong, but what are we doing right?
Well, there's a number of things that we're doing right that we should be doing more of. One is providing an education for inmates. They typically, for whatever reason, never got even through high school. And the numbers are about, I don't know the recent numbers, but at one time the numbers were about 60% did not have a high school education. So if they get a high school education, that's one thing. And we know that a high school education lowers recidivism. The second thing we do is provide them counseling, whether it's drug abuse counseling or other kind of counselings, that helps them get their cognitive behavioral skills right. I mean, they get taught to think how you're going to do something and think through the process. Regrettably, not enough of them take that to heart, but those who do usually stay out. The third and biggest thing we do, and probably the most important thing to do, is we give them a job. People don't realize this, but a lot of inmates never worked a day in their life before they got to prison. And so we give them a job. And it may be in food service, it may be mopping the floors, it may be cutting the grass. In my mind, it really doesn't matter what job they have. The issue of having to get up every morning and go to work and coming home after they're home eating their cube after they finish work is a huge issue. And we don't talk enough about that. We don't talk enough about normalizing their behavior inside the institution to mimic as much as possible the real world.
Okay. Well, we're about to wrap up. Is that right, Keone?
Yep, we're going to wrap up. And I noticed to our audience, there was an audio blip in the beginning of the episode for about 2 minutes. So just in case you missed that audio blip, you should know his name by now. But we're on here with Art Beeler, Marine veteran, retired warden. We're grateful for him being on the show. and telling us stories from his time in working with the prison system, shedding some light on some subjects and topics that we need to discuss more and talk about, and also talking about the positivities of his job. I want to thank Mark for joining on. Mark wanted to surprise you and be on here, Art, because when I told him we were going to have you on the show, it tickled him to death, and he bugged me. I want to be on there. I want to be on there. I said, okay, calm down. All right. So I thank Mark for taking time out of his busy schedule. And if you guys didn't know that out there, when Mr. Beeler was going to ECU, Mark is older than Mr. Beeler, so Mark was his professor. Yeah, Mark was Mr. Beeler's professor.
Look, I wasn't going to say this, but what we got here is failure to communicate. Communicate the truth.
That is wonderful, 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 wonderful. I just want to say thank you, Art, for being here and sharing and just think about mental illness, and all the things. But I just kept that in mind because you just brought memories of working in some of the mental health units in Butner, and that is such a tiring job. It's exhausting working with them, even though you give it your 100% and want to make it better, but it is a very, very tiring and long journey when you do that and you work with mental health. Thank you, Mark, for being with us. Good to see you again. And one thing I want to mention, hopefully in the future, we'll have a panel, including Mark and Beeler, some other people. We want to talk about corrections as well and different views, because we definitely always looking, what is it that we need to be doing for the system? And maybe we can bring some other people to take a look at what we're referring to, and maybe we can make some changes in the future, or at least suggest what we have talked about today. I want to say thank you to Keone and Keone Productions for having us. I just also want to say, if you have anything you want to share with us, anything, how to communicate with our group, is on the count.podcast@gmail.com. So please do reach out to us and let us know if you want to share anything, or maybe we can have a guest that would like to share and come on to the show. I have nothing else. It's been a pleasure having you all. Again, thank you so much, Mr. Beeler. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Keone. Let's have a great day. Be blessed. Be safe. See you all soon. Have a great day.